Everyone keeps asking the wrong question about Lebanon. They ask, did Israel win? Did Hezbollah survive? Did the ceasefire hold? Those are the questions you ask when you're watching a boxing match. But Lebanon was never a boxing match. Lebanon was a stage, and the performance that took place on that stage, the missiles, the ground incursions, the press conferences, the carefully timed humanitarian pauses, all of it was choreographically designed to answer a single deeper question: who actually controls the narrative of Middle Eastern geopolitics in the 21st century? And here's what nobody in Washington or Tel Aviv wants to admit out loud. Iran answered that question. Not with a nuclear weapon, not with a direct military confrontation. Iran answered it by doing something far more sophisticated, far more patient, and far more devastating to American credibility than any missile could ever be. Iran used Lebanon as a mirror, and when the United States and Israel looked into it, the whole world saw exactly what they are. I want to walk you through this carefully because what happened in Lebanon over the last 2 years is not just a military story, it's a geopolitical revelation. It's the moment where the gap between what America says it stands for and what America actually does became so wide that even America's closest allies started measuring it. And once that gap is visible, once the whole world can see it clearly, it cannot be unseen. Let's start with what Iran actually built in Lebanon, because most Western analysis gets this completely wrong. The dominant narrative in American media is that Iran armed Hezbollah. That framing makes it sound like Iran shipped some weapons over the border and called it a day. But that is not what happened. What Iran actually did over 4 decades was construct the most sophisticated non-state military infrastructure in modern history. We're talking about precision-guided missiles that could hit targets within meters of accuracy. We're talking about a tunnel network so extensive that Israeli military planners, some of the best in the world, said it exceeded anything they had encountered. We're talking about a command structure that survived the assassination of senior leaders, adapted its communications in real time, and maintained operational coherence under conditions that would have collapsed most conventional armies. This matters because it reframes the entire question of what Iran used Lebanon for. Iran didn't use Lebanon as a weapons depot. Iran used Lebanon as a laboratory. A laboratory for testing what a 21st century asymmetric power can actually accomplish against the most technologically advanced military alliance on the planet. And the results of that laboratory experiment are now in. Let me tell you what they found. Israel, backed by the United States with billions of dollars in military aid, with the most advanced air defense system ever deployed, with intelligence capabilities that are genuinely world-class. Israel spent over a year conducting one of the most intensive military campaigns since the Second World War. They killed senior Hezbollah commanders. They destroyed significant portions of Hezbollah's weapons infrastructure. They displaced over 1 million people in southern Lebanon. By every conventional military metric, Israel achieved substantial tactical results. And yet, at the end of that campaign, Hezbollah was still firing rockets into northern Israel. The displacement of Israeli civilians from the north, over 60,000 people who had fled their homes, had not been reversed. The Israeli government was negotiating a ceasefire through American intermediaries, a ceasefire that Hezbollah's political wing had to agree to, which means Hezbollah was sitting at the table as a party whose consent was required. And the fundamental strategic question that Israel went into Lebanon to answer, can we destroy Hezbollah, remained unanswered in the way that Israel needed to be answered. That is not a victory. That is a stalemate, dressed up in the language of victory. And Iran knew it would be. Iran planned for it. Here's where I want to slow down and make an argument that I think is important, and that is not being made clearly enough anywhere in mainstream analysis. Iran's strategy in Lebanon was never designed to defeat Israel militarily. Think about that for a moment, because it completely reframes everything. When you understand that Iran was never trying to win a conventional military confrontation through Hezbollah, the entire picture changes. Iran was doing something much more interesting. Iran was using the military conflict as a vehicle for political and perceptual campaign aimed not at Israel, but at the United States. And not at the United States government, but at the rest of the world's perception of the United States. Let me explain what I mean. The United States has built its global influence on two foundational claims. The first claim is moral. America stands for democracy, human rights, international law, and the protection of civilian populations. The second claim is practical. America is the indispensable nation, the one whose partnership you need to be on the right side of, the one whose enemies you don't want to be, the one whose security guarantees are worth something. Both of these claims were put on trial in Lebanon, and both of them failed the test in ways that Iran had predicted and in many respects engineered. On the moral claim, the United States found itself in the position of providing weapons, diplomatic cover, and United Nations Security Council vetoes to a military operation in Lebanon that resulted in the deaths of thousands of civilians, the destruction of entire neighborhoods, and what international humanitarian organizations described as a catastrophic civilian infrastructure collapse. The images from southern Beirut, from Dahia, from the villages along the Litani River, those images circled the globe, and every time those images aired alongside the news that the United States had just approved another weapons transfer to Israel, another piece of America's moral credibility crumbled. The argument presented is not a broad claim that the United States was wrong to support Israel, but rather a more precise geopolitical assessment. The core issue is not military capability, but strategic optics, narrative control, and long-term credibility. In this framing, the central claim is that the United States struggled to manage the global perception of its support for Israel in a way that preserved its broader international standing, and that this failure created strategic consequences that adversarial actors, particularly Iran, were able to anticipate and exploit. From this perspective, the key mechanism of exploitation is not direct military confrontation, but asymmetric conflict design. Iran's strategic ecosystem, including its relationship with Hezbollah in Lebanon, is described as operating in a calibrated manner. Iran allegedly shaped the conditions of engagement so that Hezbollah maintained a level of sustained pressure on northern Israel without fully deploying its most advanced capabilities. Rocket fire and border tensions were sufficient to provoke a continued military response from Israel, while deeper assets, such as precision missile stockpiles, elite units, and hardened infrastructure, were largely preserved. This created a structural asymmetry. Israel was engaged in a visible and prolonged military campaign that produced extensive destruction and civilian casualties, yet did not achieve a decisive or strategically conclusive outcome against Hezbollah. In turn, this dynamic generated persistent international attention and political controversy. The argument suggests that Iran's intent was not necessarily to maximize Hezbollah's battlefield performance in that moment, but to ensure that the conflict remained visible, prolonged, and politically costly for Israel and its primary supporter, the United States. Within this interpretation, the central battlefield is not only military, but informational. Iran's strategy is described as exploiting the gap between American rhetorical commitments, particularly around human rights, civilian protection, and international law, and the perceived selectivity of their application in practice. When the United States is seen as defending an ally while civilian casualties mount, critics argue that this creates a credibility gap in its global messaging. The result is not just regional criticism, but broader recalibration among third countries assessing the reliability of American diplomatic alignment. A key component of this argument is the distinction between military power and perceived legitimacy. No serious observer disputes the overwhelming conventional military superiority of the United States or Israel. The claim instead focuses on the performance of values, the idea that global influence depends not only on force, but on whether that force appears consistent with stated principles. When global audiences perceive inconsistency, the reputational cost extends beyond the immediate conflict zone. The argument then shifts from narrative warfare to alliance credibility. Israel is presented as the most significant example of American military partnership, receiving extensive funding, advanced systems, intelligence integration, and diplomatic backing. Despite this, the inability to achieve decisive strategic outcomes in a sustained confrontation with Hezbollah is framed as an important signal to other U.S. partners. States such as Taiwan, South Korea, and Gulf partners are described as observing not just capability, but limits of deterrence under real conflict conditions. From this perspective, the implication is not that American power is ineffective, but that its translation into guaranteed strategic outcomes is more conditional than previously assumed. This introduces uncertainty into alliance calculations, particularly for states whose security doctrines rely heavily on extended deterrence guarantees. The discussion then expands to regional diplomacy, especially the Arab world and normalization frameworks. The Abraham Accords are presented as a turning point, premised on the assumption that several Arab governments could normalize relations with Israel without severe domestic backlash. However, the escalation of conflict in Gaza and Lebanon is argued to have significantly altered Arab public opinion dynamics. Countries such as United Arab Emirates, Bahrain, and others involved in normalization efforts faced intensified domestic scrutiny as public sentiment in parts of the Arab world became increasingly reactive to images of sustained conflict and civilian suffering. In this framing, even potential expansion of normalization, particularly with Saudi Arabia, became politically constrained due to rising domestic costs. The argument attributes strategic foresight to Iran, suggesting that it understood these domestic political thresholds and anticipated that sustained conflict visibility would raise the political price of normalization across the region. As a result, the broader American project of regional integration is described as having suffered a significant delay, not through direct state-on-state escalation, but through the indirect consequences of prolonged proxy conflict visibility. Beyond the Middle East, the analysis situates these developments within a broader global realignment. It argues that repeated episodes of contested intervention, vetoes at the United Nations Security Council, and perceived inconsistencies in the application of international norms have contributed to a gradual erosion of confidence in a rules-based order led by the United States. Institutions such as the International Court of Justice are referenced as part of a wider system in which legal and moral judgments increasingly intersect with geopolitical disagreement. In this context, alternative power centers, particularly China and Russia, are described as benefiting indirectly from the perception of fragmentation within the Western-led order. While these states differ ideologically and strategically, they are portrayed as converging in their interest in a more multipolar system where U.S. influence is less dominant and less decisive. The narrative also emphasizes the role of the Global South as an increasingly influential audience in international legitimacy contests. In this view, the key shift is not elite-level diplomacy, but mass perception. How populations across Africa, Latin America, and parts of Asia interpret the consistency of international norms when applied to different actors under conflict conditions. A major counter-argument acknowledges that Iran and its network of aligned forces have also absorbed significant costs. Hezbollah leadership losses, disrupted logistics, and degraded operational capacity are cited as real tactical impacts. Similar pressures have been felt across Iran's broader regional network, including in Syria, Iraq, and Yemen. However, the strategic rebuttal offered in the text is that these losses were secondary to a different objective, not preservation of proxy strength, but alteration of geopolitical perception. In this framing, Iran's model of strategy prioritizes political outcomes over battlefield metrics. Success is measured not only in territorial or military terms, but in shifts in deterrence perception, alliance confidence, and narrative framing. This leads to a broader theoretical distinction between two models of power. The United States is described as operating under a doctrine where military superiority is expected to translate into decisive strategic outcomes. Under this model, effectiveness is measured through tangible battlefield indicators, enemy degradation, territorial control, and operational success. Iran, by contrast, is described as operating under a more distributed model of power projection, in which narrative, endurance, and asymmetric engagement matter as much as kinetic success. Under conditions of global media saturation and real-time conflict visibility, perception itself becomes a strategic domain. Finally, the analysis situates all of this within a long-term trajectory, the erosion of legitimacy frameworks that supported post-Cold War international order. The core claim is not that a new order has fully replaced the old one, but that confidence in the old assumptions, particularly regarding automatic alignment between military dominance and political legitimacy, is weakening. The consequence of this erosion is not immediate collapse, but increasing friction, higher transaction costs in diplomacy, greater difficulty in building consensus at international institutions, and more contested interpretations of global events. For the United States, whose global role has historically depended on coordinating collective action, this shift represents a structural challenge. For Iran, which has often operated outside that system, it represents relative strategic advantage. The concluding point is methodological rather than ideological. It emphasizes that analyzing these dynamics does not require endorsing any actor involved. Instead, it requires separating moral evaluation from structural interpretation, understanding how different strategic logics interact in a complex, multipolar, information-saturated international environment.